This episode of Spiral Theory, I am being interviewed by Molly McLaughlin. I met Molly at a dissection course taught by Gil Headley at the Institute for Anatomical Research in Colorado Springs. Molly is a triathlete, a yoga teacher, and a practitioner. She is a coach working with the unconscious mind. Molly holds certifications in pranic healing and is also a massage therapist. Molly is an extremely talented flutist who toured internationally with artists such as Jethro Tull. I'm very excited to welcome Molly as our interviewer today, as I am the guest for this episode of Spiral Theory.
Hello and welcome to Spiral Theory. My name is Molly McLaughlin and I am thrilled to be here with Shila LaGrua. Shila is the founder of Body Center St. Pete, as well as the creator of Spiral Theory, a unique manual therapy and movement technique designed to address scoliotic patterns. And this is informed and understood through patterns that we see in the natural world. Shila, your background is one of devotion to learning about life in a human body and to synthesizing a staggering number of methodologies into your own way of seeing. And just to give people a sense of your training and life experience, you are trained in the Kelly Kane School of Pilates, through Om Yoga, through neurosomatic therapy with Paul St. John. You're trained in OOV, Feldenkrais, Alexander Technique, Baral Visceral Manipulation. You have a certificate in the Schroth method from the Barcelona Scoliosis Physical Therapy School. You are also a Reiki practitioner and have trained and performed extensively as a dancer. All of these paths to learning have coalesced in you and led to the creation of Spiral Theory. And I'm so glad to be here with you and to talk spirals. How did spirals first come into your consciousness?
So the first thing I can think of when you ask that question is me doodling spirals. That was the first time I remember thinking, like, why spirals? Like, always doodling spirals. So that must have been some subconscious thing happening. But my doodle was always a spiral. So that was always going on. Then really wasn't a big part of my consciousness until, so years later, after all the doodling, I lost a significant person in my life. He was a high school sweetheart, and I was in college at the time, but we were still dating. And when he died, I remember thinking that I would see him again in the afterlife. And my vision of that was his essence was a spiral. It was like a tornado, kind of. It was like a whirl of energy. And I can picture it in my mind's eye. It's like a little Tasmanian devil. So I always imagine reuniting with this person in the afterlife, like two spirals, like, hey, I remember you. So that came into my mind as well when you asked that question. But ultimately, the big spiral thing that I now call spiral theory, and the whole thing that I do with the body work, that all started much later in my training. So as a neurosomatic therapist, and while I worked at the St. John Clark Pain Treatment Center, a lot of the spiral metaphors were knocking at my door really hard, and it started coming at me like that. I think it was either after or right before I was told to study the Schroth method by my boss at the time. So it was right around the time that I was getting really interested in scoliosis. I started seeing more and more and more spirals in nature, and it just really started bombarding me at that point. So early on, it was like doodles, and then my feeling of like what the afterlife is like. It's like whirls of energy rather than orb like or whatever image you might have of the afterlife. To me, it was always like little spirals of energy. So that's kind of where it started. And then it got really, really went into it with the scoliosis and the body work. And that was years later.
So, what is spiral theory?
Spiral theory is a method of charting and naming the curves that are present in every human form. And with that information, using neurological laws to define what we would do with that mapping to come to a place of more balance in the human body.
I love how you use the language of the many curves found in every form, which is very different from saying working directly with scoliosis. I've heard you talk about that we all exhibit these patterns, whether we're categorized as having scoliosis or not. But how do you see scoliosis, and what are these patterns? How does the spiral present in our bodies?
Yeah, let's talk about like scoliosis for a moment, because it's considered a disease. It's considered a malformation, traditional definition wise. But the way I look at it is it's the same wave of energy or pattern within the body that is also responsible for development and growth and also destruction. So it's the same spiral, but it seems to have gotten stuck, so to speak, in someone that would be given that diagnosis, scoliosis label. It's almost like that wave of energy is halted and not flowing. And what we would like to do is have it not be a stuck pattern, but a pattern that we can move through and move out of and move into it on the other side and be fluid with it rather than it being a stuck pattern.
Yeah, when you're talking about this wave of energy that is both growing and destructing, can you say more on that?
So it starts really early on, like in embryology. I've been reading a lot more about embryology lately, and very early on in the cleavage phase, when our cells are dividing, something really interesting happens. The cell division takes a 90-degree turn before it completes. So it's already spiraling right at the beginning of cell division. Then around day 28, or 24, 25 to 28, somewhere in there, limb bud rotation starts to take place. So our little limbs are these tiny little buds, and they spiral externally on the upper arms and internally in the upper limbs, and internally in the lower limbs to come into existence. So even in embryology, I'm seeing this helical force, right? But then when you look at once we're developed, the first organ that develops is the heart. And we've talked about this, how the heart is pretty much a spiral in and of itself. And the way the blood flows in the body, has a helical effect in the fluid movement as well. Our DNA, our spirals, the way, not just spirals, but also, because I get into the Fibonacci sequence a lot, just our design is within the Fibonacci sequence. So the ratios within our body. So it's like the golden ratio, divine patterning. And I see all of that in our human development. When you really look at it with that lens, you can see that. And then it goes beyond our human development. And then in nature in general, just very inspired by plants, shells, flowers, of course, the galaxies, the ocean, there's so many things that if you look at it, there's a connection to the Fibonacci sequence or the golden ratio, or somehow just a spiral shape. And then beyond, again, Fibonacci and spiral, I also love to look at nature in its fractal geometry. in that lens as well. And you can see that patterning in a microcosmic way and a macrocosmic way in the universe. So I put all of this together and just use it as a guide to compare how we see the human body in its natural form. So it's like, instead of looking at scoliosis as a disease, that it's part of this same mathematical consequence that ends up putting form in a solidified way in the universe. So it seems like almost all of nature has a little bit of that spiral force that brought it into existence.
Spiral as life expressing. So when
like
you
life force.
Life force. So when somebody who has been named, has been said to have, okay, given a diagnosis of you have scoliosis, they come to you. Can you give me an example of somebody who, when they arrive, what they are experiencing, and then how you apply spiral theory and what the results are of this way of working?
So the majority of my clients, I like to call them clients instead of patients, but the majority of my clients are actually not scoliosis clients. They're actually just people in pain. And a lot of times it's mostly pain related issues. Sometimes it's postural related issues without the pain involvement, but it's usually pain. And what I'm really doing is I'm using all the principles that I learned off of my scoliotic patients on everyone. And that's where I feel like spiral theory is magical in its effects, because these people wouldn't be diagnosed with scoliosis. They usually need a 10-degree Cobb angle curve or higher to be diagnosed with scoliosis. And most of my clients have less than, it's about 5 degrees. You're just seeing the tiniest little deviation. So it wouldn't be diagnosable, but the same forces are happening. The same patterning is happening. And it's neurologically, it's the way it's called the law of facilitation. So the impulses are traversed in the same pathway over and over and over again. So these patterns end up stuck in the individual, and it usually is a very small degree of the same pattern that you would see at a larger degree in a scoliotic client. So I'm using spiral theory on everyone. And the principles that it boils down to are essentially what properties go with what areas of the curve. And I can go into that more if you'd like, but that's basically, it's the mapping. And once I have the mapping, the results, the training that I had as a neurosomatic therapist was really comprehensive. And we spent a lot of time charting. We charted like 90 different places in the body, different bony landmarks, and comparing right and left, tilt, rotation. So all three planes, tilt, rotation, and in the sagittal plane. So with that training, you would think, okay, so you can really figure out geometrically where the tension might be. However, with just that mapping, that neurosomatic therapy training that I got, it wasn't really enough. It wasn't answering all the questions. And it also was a little bit broad, even though the mapping was so specific. Like, for instance, if my right shoulder is forward, we were taught like there are certain things that would twist the body forward in the back and the front. And there are certain things that would pull this back. So we have to look at both. But we were kind of taught to stay in this general area. But when I'm looking at spiral theory, I'm looking at anything in the body that has that force would be involved. So it could be too much grounding on that same side's big toe could do that. Or taking some part of the other side's hip back could be doing that. So even far away from the source of where you're seeing that distortion can be big forces moving through the body, through the fascia, and manifesting in a distortion far away from the source. And of course, I know that from being a dancer because of where we had to initiate our movements from. Sometimes we initiated from the ground. Sometimes we initiated from distally, far, like the furthest point in our body, and sometimes it was proximally. Sometimes it was the closest point from our midline that was initiating. But that was one way that we described how to make movement more like synchronized, how we can all make it look the same if we have to be in unison, for instance. So we would talk about, where is this initiating from? So I know from being a dancer that you can make big things happen from an initiation very far away from the source. So I'm looking at that in my intakes, because I want to know what people are doing with their bodies all day long. And I'm putting this map into almost like a movement perspective. I'm not thinking of the charting and the mapping, because we're doing it in a posture, just a standing posture. So it's called static measurements. I also do functional movement measurements to see where things are functionally. But in that static measuring, there's a lot of interpretations that can be made, and they might not be accurate to the movement that's being produced that's creating the problem. So I like to look at not just the static measurements, but also what's happening in movement. So to get the full picture.
Much of this is conscious and unconscious for somebody, for all of us. I mean, we're all exhibiting these patterns. That's, I think, really, really helpful to understand. And so when you're mapping and getting a sense of the pattern happening in someone's body, what is your role and what is their role in moving towards a more functional and moving away from pain? Like, I guess I'm curious about these patterns that we're living in are largely unconscious. We can bring them to our consciousness, but even then it's like so much of our experience is unconscious, that how do we interact with them and changing how they play and how they show up in our body?
Yeah, that's a great question. The patterning that we end up in our bodies when we move in certain patterns, or even when we're still, when we have posture habits, the fascia ends up being lining up in those postural or movement lines of force. So over time, fascia is trying to support the position or the movements that you're doing all the time, by lengthening or shortening to make it easier for you. So as an example, if you sit all the time, your fascia will solidify into a sitting position unless you move out of that every once in a while, like daily, to break it up. But if you don't, if you sit, and then you sit in the morning, say when you're eating and doing your morning routine, and then you sit on the way to work, and then you sit at work, and then you sit on your way home to work, and then you sit watching TV. So if it's that much sitting every single day, then your body's going to be like, great, let me just make the fascia in a sitting shape so it's more efficient for you. So it's actually trying to help us. So when we look at these habits, and they're subconscious, completely subconscious, but our fascia ends up getting more solidified in those shapes. And tensegrity is this concept of tension with integrity. So there's outward forces and inward forces that are keeping our posture afloat and upright. And when we get into these habitual patterns, the symmetry isn't necessarily there, but the balance is still there. So your body is counterbalancing, but potentially in an asymmetrical way. So it's still trying to help us. So we, say we deviate a little because we always lean on our right shoulder. Well, then our body's going to do something that deviates the other way. So there's a counterbalance, but it might not be symmetrical on the same shoulder doing the counter. It might be like a zigzag pattern, which is often what we feel. We feel like our zigzag when we're feeling off in our bodies. So what I do manually is break up that fascia. So then the nervous system has a chance to move and engage in ways that would have been bound up and maybe not allowing for that full movement without that type of release. So in that part of spiral theory technique it could be any type of body work because I use a ton of different modalities. So it could be myofascial release. It could be effleurage. It could be trigger point therapy. It could be, Feldenkrais movement on the table. Almost any manual movement theory therapy that you can think of is valid. And then I take that, or manual therapy, and then I take that and I bring it into movement. So then when the body starts to break down some of those habitual place holding patterns fascially, right? Then there's an awareness of, oh, I can move my body into a different space that I didn't even know was available. And then we try to integrate it. And I know this is a really long-winded answer, but then when I integrate it, the best tool that I have found thus far is the OOV. I used to do neurological repatterning, which is the term I use for exercise. I used to do neurological repatterning without the OOV. I'm trained in yoga and in Pilates, and I have a dance background. And I wasn't, just to clarify, I wasn't trained in Feldenkrais and Alexander, but I had it as a student for many years. So I use some of those techniques as well. So I will employ all of the techniques and bring them into whatever seems to communicate best with that person, and combine manual as well as movement therapies that favor the part of the pattern that doesn't get that movement. So we're tapping into a possibility of joint range that body might not have even known was there.
That's so powerful because two things strike me. One is how necessary and important it is to work with other people to really expand out of our patterns and to move into diversity of movement. Mm-hmm. We have agency in that, but it's getting to experience hands-on work is almost inherently going to be different than whatever I've been doing in my own body over and over and over and over. So there's such a huge benefit and expanse of range of what I can experience by working with a practitioner. And the zigzag, I would love if you would talk more about the zigzag pattern and maybe an example of what that looks like.
Okay. So let me see if I can come up with a good example. Well, I mean, I guess I could take the same thing that we were saying. Like, say you have a center console in your car, and it's really easy to lean your elbow on that center console. And so you don't even think twice. Every time you drive, you're leaning down on that shoulder. So because that shoulder ends up leaning all the time when you're driving, it's more likely to be leaning when you're at the desk. So that might be your position at the desk, because it's already, the fascia is already pulling lines of force that make that easier. So your body, to find comfort, often goes into the pattern. It's actually more comfortable for the joints because it's used to that all the time. When you start to go out of it, it's actually a stretch, and it's not familiar, and it's not familiar territory, and it ends up being an effort. So we go into our patterns for comfort. That's what happens every night when we sleep. That's why we have to wake up and stretch like a cat or dog, which is a part of Gil Hedley's famous fuzz speech video. Every cat in the world wakes up and stretches. It's so true. So it's like very natural to have to wake up and undo this we want to go into these places, and just to undo that a little bit. But for instance, so if I am leaning down on my right shoulder, there is something in my body that then has to lean to the left. Because if you think of how counterbalance works, if I don't counterbalance that force, there's going to be too much wear and tear on the joints with a constant lean one direction it really wouldn't even work. You would have to have a counterbalance the other direction in order to stand upright. So oftentimes you'll see a shoulder going one way, a rib cage going the other way, and then the hip going again the other way. And then you can keep looking up and down the line. You'll see maybe a neck, and then the cranium might be shaped a little differently than the knees, and then the ankles. I call that the wave. I can't stop seeing that wave once I started seeing it. I just can't, I just see the wave from head to toe. And that took years of being able to see that. But once I started seeing, I cannot unsee it. So that counterbalance is the first thing I'm looking at when someone comes into my room or into the door. And then I watch them walk into the room. I'm already mapping them out. They don't know it, but I am. And while they're walking back, I usually take their bag. I said, let me hold your purse. And it's the first door on the right. And I'm watching them walk. They don't even know. So I'm already gathering the wave pattern. And then once I get them in the room, then I go through what's called the Adams test and all the measurements that I learned. Well, I go through a simplified version of the measurements that I learned with neurosomatic therapy. If there's something that really stands out that I want to check statically. And then depending on what they're telling me, then I might do some movement assessments to see where everything's at there. So I'm looking at that zigzag is essentially the wave pattern that ends up being the scoliosis.
This is 3D. I mean, I think that sometimes we can get into the thinking around a scoliotic pattern of the two-dimensionality of it, even the idea of a zigzag, that it's like a side to side, but you speak about the movement of snakes and an epiphany that you had about the three-dimensionality of the wave and how that is presenting throughout our spine. You want to talk about snakes? I do.
Yes. Yes. And also about that zigzag, it's almost like, you know how roller coasters, when they go through the loops and it's like twirling as it goes around in the loop. It's kind of like that. I almost picture like we're inside a wine glass and we're curving like as if we're following the contour of that wine glass. So we learn our planes, right? Our anatomical planes. It's the same in boating. My husband is a captain, but the boat can, I don't know all the words. It's like roll. I actually don't know the boating terms, but it's the same as anatomy, right? Our anatomical terms. So we can go forward and back, just like a boat can rock this way, right? Side to side, like a boat, and then the rotation. So this is our three-dimensional reality. There's more than that because we can expand and we can contract, and then there's time. So there's a little more than just these three planes, but just to keep it simple, this is our three-dimensional reality. And so when you take that three-dimensional reality, and when we're taught about it and about what movements happen in each plane, it's very rectilinear. It's like, okay, sagittal plane is forward and back. And so you imagine forward and back, and it's very military. Like I can bend my knee, I can flex my spine. And then the frontal plane or the coronal plane, okay, it's a side to side. So it's like side to side. Okay, I learned the way I remembered it is, you know, you can't get any more movement out of that as if you were in a toaster oven, right? If you're like a piece of toast in a toaster oven, you know, that you only can move in the frontal plane. And then with the transverse plane, same thing, rotation, rotation. So it's kind of like this asterisk, but there's nothing in nature that's a straight line. So when I think about each plane now, I see how they're coupled. It's called Freiheit's law. They're coupled. It's a neurological law. So as you rotate, there is a side bend that will happen. As you side bend, there is a rotation that will happen. And forward and back will be part of that as well. So they all happen together. So when I was first starting my therapy practice, I still thought of each plane very rectilinearly, like, oh, they have a hip shear to the side, as if the hips just shifted over, like a Hez candy coming out, like, boop. And it's just not like that. If it shears to the side, it's shearing in that rotation. So it's combined with the other two planes, always.
And you've spoken
and then
of
the snakes.
Yeah, snakes. The snake image is so cool too. It's similar
Snakes
to the roller
coming,
coaster, but did you have
Yes.
sort of something occurred to you as you were observing the movement of how a snake is actually propelling forward?
When scoliosis first came into my consciousness, this is when I was at the St. John Clark Pain Treatment Center, and Randy Clark handed me a big yellow book, which was the Schroth Method book. And he said, learn this. And I said, okay. And that was literally the beginning. It was like a seed was planted. But back then, when I started studying scoliosis, that's when I started getting interested in snakes, because in Florida, we have snakes around, right? We have worms and snakes. And anytime I would see one, I would really stare at it like, that is a full on scoliosis in action right now. Like, that's cool. So I would watch it slither, seeing if I can get any information out of it. And it just started fascinating me. And then fast forward, I don't talk about this that often, but I want to hear a little bit. I had a download as part of my understanding of spiral theory. It was like the only download I've ever had that was that clear. So in the download, there was a message to me to say, study snake locomotion. It literally said that. So since I was already interested in the movement of snakes, it made perfect sense. I'm like, yeah. I went home and started Googling, and oh my gosh, it was an incredible discovery that as the snake slithers, it's not just going side to side. I couldn't observe it with my naked eye without seeing this or reading this, but as it slithers, the concave area of the slither actually picks up off the ground. So the concavities are the convexities, you would call it, are walking. They're kind of stepping as they slither forward. That's Friet's law. That is Friet's law in the spine. That is exactly what happens in a scoliotic spine. When we side bend one way, we are rotating towards the convexity. That is exactly what's happening in our foot as our foot points change as we go through the gait cycle. There's so many places where this slither is actually in our makeup. It's also energetically what, they call Kundalini, and we're both yoga practitioners. And so, so that serpent energy is described as being dormant at the base of our spine and our sacrum. And as we are enlightened, that energy slithers up through the chakra system and gets to our third eye, and then we're enlightened. But interestingly, my first understanding of that Kundalini traveling up the chakra system was this side to side travel, because that's how they taught it. It wasn't until later that I realized, oh, it's actually spiraling up. It is spiraling up. And if you drew that, it would look two-dimensional. It would look like a squiggle line, but it's actually in that wine glass, so to speak, just spiraling up that way. So energetically and physically, there are these places in our body that are following Friet's law. And I learned it through studying snake locomotion of all things, but that was part of the download. The download was telling me what to research. That's what it was, just like this. It was just really just giving me instructions on what to research. It's really cool.
That's so incredible. And so I love that I read the words about spiral theory, that part of your mission is to demystify for practitioners, for manual therapists, and for movement practitioners how to work with scoliotic patterns. How would you say, from that major epiphany and download that you had from the locomotion of snakes, from the movement of snakes, how does that help? How do you want that to inform how people are perceiving scoliotic patterns, and how to help people get out of pain and move better?
Yeah. I feel like one of the biggest obstacles, if you have scoliosis, is that you're taught that it can't change. Mm-hmm. But it actually can, and it's been proven. So I don't know why that's being taught. I really am not sure why that's being taught. There is a ton of research that shows that you can change the degree of a Cobb angle. It's usually research that's combining something like the Schroth method and bracing, or just bracing alone. But usually bracing is combined with a movement therapy. And it's the Schroth researchers that have really found that you can change Cobb angle. So that can happen. And I was even in a course, I think it was postural respiration, and most of the people in the course were PTs. And the instructor asked, how many people were taught that you can't change scoliosis? Can't change scoliosis. And the whole room raised their hand. And that wasn't that long ago. So Yeah. So here we are thinking that this is a disease and that it can't change. And so that already just it's a limiting belief, right? It limits what the possibilities are. So the other thing that I have found with not only scoliosis type therapies, but also just in my own practice and observation is that you can't take one curve, say the largest curve, and expect to shove that into place without taking every single other curve in the body into consideration. So I think that's a pitfall with not only Schroth method, but also just almost all of the scoliotic methods is that they're not looking beyond the trunk. It's really just, it's a spine issue. I'm going to deal with it through the spine. I have to say, including the limbs has been the key to unlock scoliosis in my body, let alone all my clients. So the limbs inform the spine. So if you are not taking this shifting beyond the spine, you're not going to get a change because you have to look at the whole body. We can't just cut off our arms and legs and not have that be part of the picture. And then furthermore, the feet are so important. They're like one of the most proprioceptive places in the body for one, but they also are a microcosm of your entire body. So, the heel is the sits bone, the arch is the low back. It goes to the big toe being the head. So, and then all the organs in between. So our feet are a reflection of our spine and our trunk. So if we're not taking our work down into the legs and feet, it's going to get push back and it'll just, nothing will really budge. And that's, I feel like the biggest thing that it's discouraging for scoliosis clients is that they often get to a plateau no matter how hard they work. And I just consider it a daily practice to check in and derotate and let energy flow through my whole body and try to have the areas that are super habitually stuck to just invite them to see another place in my joint space. Just invite them to see what it's like to live there and move there. And then let my body make its decisions the rest of my day. Just have my small practice that includes the whole body. Derotating includes some diaphragm work, definitely some footwork. I look a lot at the scapula and ilium connection with the oblique myofascial slings, but it just has to be much more than the trunk. It goes into the eyes. The eyes have so much to do with it as well. C1 is part of all of that. So it is a body-wide approach. It is not just the trunk. So I think that's a big, important piece.
And a life-changing piece for people to be held by somebody who really understands that change is absolutely possible without having a doubt. What have you noticed in clients that you've worked with?
Just regular clients or scoliosis clients?
Scoliosis clients.
I mean, because they're almost all scoliosis,
both,
so when I get a scoliosis client, their Cobb angle is usually up there. It's like 30 to 40 degrees. Like it's a huge scoliosis. I get people that have not had Harrington rods, and I have people that have had anywhere from a few segments fused to full Harrington rods. So I've even worked with a client that had her Harrington rods taken out. So I've worked with people with and without rods or hardware of any kind. And it's you can still work and you can still create a sense of change even within the hardware, like a sense of I have some agency even in this kind of like jail, so to speak, of hardware. So back to your question. Wait, what was your question one more time?
What have you observed and what becomes possible for people working in this way?
Yeah. So with a scoliotic client, a lot of them have done, straight up Stroth technique. A lot of them have done, there's the Spine Institute here in this area. There's other techniques that, not like the Stroth, but that they take PVC pipes and ropes and they pull in opposite directions. It's very painful, apparently, and you have to stay and be held in this pull for long periods of time. And then the recoil effect is usually not comfortable. So there's all kinds of techniques like that out here. And when I get a scoliotic patient client, they usually have gone through those things. So what I like to offer them is something a little more accessible and a little more body wide. And I feel like I'm giving them a window of being able to work with something. Like, I feel like when they come to me, they don't have anything to work with. They just have these distortions that don't seem to budge, and they're just at a loss. So I get really excited at the littlest movement that can mobilize out of that, and then finding some strength and finding a different place to breathe into and a different place to ground in your feet. It's just like, if we can just introduce new options to the body, it has more choices to make. It's not going to be stuck in its facilitated neurological pathway every single time. So if it's a non-scoliosis client, I get a lot of people that are pretty impressed that I can identify and work with an issue, maybe even resolve it temporarily in the first session. A lot of people work with the same pain for many years and they don't get anywhere with where the work they're doing, the traditional PT, and then all kinds of other, you can do injections, all kinds of things are out there, right? So I get the gamut, and people that come with all of that stuff, and I'm trying to empower them. I feel like that's the key. I'm trying to give them something to work with. Like, you can wake up and have a choice. Your spine doesn't have to be there. You can breathe a few degrees out of that. You really can. Will it stay? That just depends. It just depends on so many things. But if you can get it there for a moment, you can get it there for more than one moment. So I try to empower people, and I often get really good results. Interestingly, more so because I feel like it's shocking to a lot of people that don't have the scoliosis patterns, or that don't have severe scoliosis, that I can identify and change their musculoskeletal issues so quickly, and much quicker than I had in the past as a neurosomatic therapist. Like, now, when I apply spiral theory, it essentially never fails me. So when I was just charting, I had so many options of what could be causing that area of distortion. But with spiral theory, looking at the whole body, it's kind of it. I feel like I trust it because it's always showing me the truth. It's never a question in my mind. So I very much trust this process, and it does work. It just works. So I get very good results with most pain patients, and at least with my scoliosis patients, I give them more to work with than what they've had in the past.
And this bringing movement into new movement and new places to live into, ways to live into one's body, it's bringing me right back to your initial doodles, and especially the vision that you had of your friend and that afterlife, like life expressing as spiral, and you helping people experience that life in more fully in their own body. It's such a practice of vitality, of literally helping people be more alive and be more themselves.
Mm-hmm. And it came from originally, before I got into scoliosis, that thought process, I remember I had a lot of clients that had trigger points in their pelvis that made them feel like they needed a hip replacement. So I had quite a few people come in and say, it's like the same story. Do I need a hip replacement? Because they can't put weight on their leg because they have major trigger points in their, say, gluteus medius, so they can't bear weight. And potentially no other therapist had looked elsewhere, because that's probably a compensation. I know for sure traditional PT can't really get into other areas. They're given a prescription for, like, okay, your hip hurts. This is the hip protocol. You can't look at the ankle or look at the shoulder unless you're breaking the rules. So it's really tough. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place. But when we can look at other areas of the body and actually release a trigger point in one session to the point where you come in thinking you need surgery and you leave not thinking that, I mean, that's that's where that started. It's like, because I know as a dancer, there were days that I was like, I can't do this show. Like, I can't even turn my head. Like, how can I do this show? And you just have to, right? The show must go on. So you figure it out and you do your body work and you do what needs to happen. So I know, because of my brutal profession that was slightly masochistic, that you can, that like you can move, you can keep moving and your body will do it until it's really not. But you kind of have to be crawling on the ground for me to be like, okay, it's time for surgery. Because I really do believe that there's a lot of, it sometimes takes time. It could take a year, but there's so much change that can happen. And depending on when I got to you and how far along things are, your age, your diet, obviously there's a time and a place for conventional medicine and surgery, but I do believe it's turned to a little too quickly. I feel like we can do more organic approaches for longer and try to find better outcomes. People don't often give it enough time, some of the alternative therapies. I feel like you need, even a simple disc herniation, if you're not treating a major herniation with surgery, it's going to take about a year. A meniscus tear will take about a year before you're jumping and running again. You have to be patient with it. Something that seems to take 1 second as an injury can take 8 months to heal. So we just have to be super patient. But yeah, I do believe that it's all possible. And then with scoliosis, having that same, I believe in the body to heal. I believe in it to hold us up. We just have to give it the environment to heal. So that same example of the person coming in that feels like they need surgery because they can't put weight on their leg, I put that example into my scoliotic patients, that I also feel like you're not stuck this way. You can make some changes. And all of that comes from me being a dancer and knowing that you can work on yourself and move better.
And we're far more fluid than we think.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we are.
Waves expressing. Wow. Is there anything else that you want to touch on about spiral theory or about your experience, your background?
I do attribute a lot of how I see things to my dance background. I feel like I had mentioned earlier, I feel like every time I'm looking at someone, I'm looking at their history of movement. And I know a lot of people in my field don't have that lens. So I feel very lucky to have that lens, because I feel like that's part of how I can get to things and handle them a little more quickly. It's like, okay, what was the movement pattern that got you there? Someone did some big job for a day and all of a sudden they can't walk. I'm taking that job. I want to know how they did it. And I'm going to overlay the action they did onto their spiral theory mapping. And then that's their treatment. So I feel very fortunate that dance was informing me, that it is informing me, my dance background and movement background. And I also feel very fortunate that I had these movement therapy techniques as part of warm-ups, literally warm-ups. We were doing Feldenkrais and Alexander almost every day. So we use these movement therapies as dance warm-up. So it's very much in my bones to use movement or think of movement as a way in or a way out. Like a way into the body or a way out of the problems. Always. When people ask me like, who treats you? I do get treatments once in a while, but to be totally honest, most of the time when something's hurting me, I want to figure it out through movement. I often get on the OOV, and I guess I could touch on the OOV just a little bit more, but I often get on the OOV and I want to move my way out of it. I'm not one to get the ball and just start digging in. I want to figure out what's going on with my shoulder. How does this relate to my low back? I do it through movement. So I try not to get too heavy-handed with my manual techniques either. I just want to get the fascia to find that it can whoosh and glide and slide. And because if I first touch them and it feels solid like a wall, that's not benefiting their movement at all. So back to the OOV for a quick second, because this is what the one thing I could add is we were talking about subconscious versus conscious. So our habits are there, they're subconscious. I didn't even understand what was happening in my body until I figured out spiral theory, because my scoliotic curve isn't that obvious. When you see my x-ray, it's not a lateral deviation, but there's a lot of rotation. So I'm not diagnosable. I don't have a 10-degree Cobb angle, but I've like a princess in the pea. I feel everything, feel every turn in my body. But so the OOV, when you're lying on the OOV, it's a rotationally unstable surface. So already it's talking to that part of ourselves from embryology, from like day 3, where we start rotating to multiply our cells. So it's like that rotary effect is already happening. And when we get on the OOV, it's almost like so I'm going to put it in real simple terms. It's almost like our whole body turns into a stem cell and that anything is possible. So when I'm on a flat surface, my habits are so freaking strong. And when I try to correct them, I correct in my pattern. So that's why I stopped doing functional exercise as homework for my clients, because they don't come back better, unfortunately, because they're exercising in their pattern. For an example, if I want a scapula to be able to retract, but that person has an upper convexity and a protraction, if they take a band and pull back, they're probably going to rotate. They're not going to retract. So they're going to go home and practice their pattern. And I learned the hard way, people not coming back better. When I started working with the OOV, that wasn't happening. So the habits, the body can not only separate and differentiate, but also come together like a symphony, better than anything on the OOV. So it's kind of a strange thing to say, okay, all your training's on the OOV, because I've even questioned that. It's like, when's the end game? Like, do I want to just get an OOV suit and live my life on an OOV? But what happens is when I spend more time on the OOV, it's cumulative, and subconsciously my body is remembering. It is remembering what it feels like to be home in my skin and not a subject of my past experiences, which is where where these deviations solidify. I feel like we're just like a scrapbook, like our Zigzag is like a scrapbook of things that have happened to us or our emotions that we've experienced because of an event. They're pretty much like stuck energy in us. And so that ties in with the subconscious as well. Like, especially if you've been through traumatizing events, if you're protecting you, there's no consciousness in that. It's innate, right? So you can't rip that out of you. You work with things, you rearrange tension. That's what we're doing. We're not shoveling tension out of your body. We're rearranging the tensegrity to have it be more even. It's really the goal. And getting on the OOV really provides that better than any tool I've ever worked with, or even working without tools. It's really provides that.
Because of the instability, like that is the key, which reminds me of when we are an embryo, we're in a liquid environment that's not a stable surface. It's like really bringing us back to that possibility and fluid form.
Yes, that's it. That hits the nail on the head. And the creator of the OOV, Daniel Vedetta, talks about that a lot. That the act of being on a flat surface, like the floor, shoes, it completely has eliminated our ability to connect with nature and the subtle impulses that nature gives us, that keeps us fluid, that keeps us womb-like, that keeps us a stem cell in a way that anything is possible. We get so solidified in our strategy. He calls it the rigidity strategy. And that's our posture. And it's not fluid at all. And you put someone on an OOV that's in a rigidity strategy, and they might be really strong, and they will fall, because it's not about strength. It's about control and tone, which is different than strength. So, and how the body comes into that as a symphony, and how even the organs are involved, and the eyes, your focus, your hearing, your breath, all of it, things you don't feel like are part of balancing. But if you study anatomy, your cranium's part of balancing, but so much is in the eyes, so much is in how we're gripping our jaw and where our ears are, so it's all about this neurological way of helping us find our way and bringing that in. So the OOV does that, and it works with the rotations and the limb rotations in such a full scope way, like full body. It's good. It's good stuff. It helped inform me about spiral theory as well, the OOV. So as I was learning the OOV and Schroth method together, that's when the big download came. So it was a big part of me understanding all of this.
Wow, this is so incredible. And I'm so grateful that spiral theory is spiraling its way out into the world as it needs to. So many people are going to benefit from your work. And you mentioned earlier that our heart is really spiralic in nature, that before a heart even exists, that blood is circulating. Circulation happens before our hearts form. And then as the organ comes into being, its vortical nature is spinning our blood. It's creating the spiral and the vortex that is why our blood is able to carry. It's the carrying capacity of all of the nutrients from our breath to the periphery into every cell of our body. And it's just feeling very on point that the heart is really, it also feels so connected into your work and the way that you see and the way that you serve people and hold the possibility, hold the life, hold the love of what else can move and change and open up so that we don't feel stuck. And like the nature of heart is one of opening. And I think you are doing that in this work. It's such an honor to hear about you and hear about spiral theory.
Thank you so much. I love that. Yes, it's actually another example of misconstrued ideas about, the heart. We're taught the heart is a pump. It won't work if it's a pump. It does what you just described so beautifully. So yeah, we can't have these limiting beliefs. We have to just open our minds to what we think is not, what we would normally think is not possible, that anything is possible. I believe that with my whole heart. So anyone that works with me, they're with someone that believes that.
Thank you so much, Shila. So wonderful to hear about your work and about you. And thank you for all that you bring into the world.
Thank you so much, Molly. It is an honor and a pleasure. And for those of you that might not know, Molly and I have done several dissection workshops with Gil Headley, and we both attended the International Fascia Congress together. And just this year, 2025, it was so inspiring. And the way I see it, we're going to be lifelong learners together. I feel like we're buddies in our journey, and I couldn't be happier about that. So thank you so much for offering to interview me on my podcast about the work I do, because I have a hard time talking about it. And you nudged me, like, you have to talk about what you're doing on your own podcast. I'm interviewing you. So thank you so much for offering and being here for that. And I look so forward to the future of learning with you.
So welcome. Likewise.